3 days before my brother's engagement party, my mother called me. I remember exactly where I was standing, folding the soft blanket of a 2-year-old I was watching that week. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter and her name lit up. I answered with a smile, thinking maybe she wanted to coordinate outfits or ask about the gift I had already prepared. Instead, I heard her voice measured and hesitant. "Elena," she began, "there's something I need to talk to you about. Something delicate." My heart dipped a little, but I stayed quiet. "You know how important this weekend is, right? Daniel is introducing Natalie to some very influential people. Her family's in finance, and many of the guests will be—" She paused, searching for the least offensive phrase. "High profile." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. She went on. "I just don't want you to feel out of place, darling. You understand, right? I didn't understand. Not at first. So I asked, 'What exactly are you saying, Mom?'" She cleared her throat. "It's just that being a nanny while noble isn't exactly the kind of image this event is tailored for. Natalie's parents are very proper, you see. And, well, it might be best if you sat this one out." She said it like she was offering me a kindness, sparing me embarrassment, but I felt the air tighten around me. I had taken time off for this. I had chosen a dress carefully soft blue with modest lace, ironed and ready. I had even written a little toast for Daniel. I had bought them a gift weeks ago, a hand-bound journal of relationship prompts with the words "building together" engraved in gold on the spine. I thought they'd find it meaningful. I thought I mattered, but all I said was, "I understand." And I ended the call. I sat down at the kitchen table in the small apartment I rented near the family I currently worked for. The sounds of cartoons buzzed from the living room where the toddler I watched was dozing off. The silence in my chest, however, was deafening. It wasn't the first time I'd been made to feel like I didn't belong, but it was the first time it was spoken so plainly. "This isn't for nannies." That's what she meant, even if she didn't say it outright. "This is for the accomplished, the polished, the publicly impressive. And me, I wipe noses and teach toddlers how to tie their shoes." My credentials were love, patience, and $20 crayons. I wanted to call Daniel. I wanted to ask if he knew, but part of me already did. This was not about Natalie's parents. This was about my parents' shame, about their obsession with perception, about how their daughter, who got a master's degree in early childhood development and turned it into a business of nurturing young minds, was still never going to be as admirable as their son, who wore suits and shook hands with CEOs. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood by the window looking out into the quiet street. Snow was starting to dust the sidewalk. I thought about my younger self, 7 years old, pretending to teach my stuffed animals. I used to line them up and give them stars for attendance. My mom used to laugh and say, "You were born to be a little teacher." But something changed. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, the warmth of that praise curdled into condescension. I don't know when I stopped being impressive. Maybe I never was. The next morning, I packed the gift in a box and slid it under the bed. I stared at the dress I had picked and wondered if I should return it. But I kept it. Not because I hoped for a change of heart, but because I refused to let them make me feel small again. I had clients to attend to that weekend. A grandmother recovering from surgery needed help with her grandson. I said yes. It was better than waiting for a phone that wouldn't ring. Better than watching photos appear on social media of a party I was erased from. I told myself it didn't matter. But as I walked through the snow-covered yard of Mrs. Retner's house that Sunday morning, my heart still ached. Not because they excluded me, but because they never thought I'd be worth including. Not even for show. Not even for a seat in the corner. And in that absence, in that brutal clarity, a part of me stopped hoping. I no longer longed to be welcomed. I just wanted to be free. Thanksgiving morning came wrapped in stillness. The city felt paused under a sheet of fresh snow rooftops, white streets muted the sky a pale silver. My phone didn't buzz. No invitation, no apology, just silence. I pulled on my coat, grabbed my thermos of coffee, and drove across town to Mrs. Retner's place. She was a retired librarian who had taken me in with kindness years ago when I was just starting out as a nanny. Her daughter had trusted me with her twins, and ever since then, Mrs. Retner called me her honorary granddaughter. 2 days earlier, she had asked if I was available to help with her great-nephew Mason. His parents were out of town, and her arthritis had flared up again. I didn't hesitate. Of course, I said. She opened the door wearing a thick gray cardigan and wool slippers. Her eyes lit up when she saw me. "You're working on Thanksgiving?" she asked gently. I smiled and shrugged. Better than waiting around for a party that wasn't mine. Mason was already bouncing in the living room surrounded by blocks and picture books. I spent the morning playing, helping him build towers, reading stories, and silly voices sneaking marshmallows into his hot chocolate. Around noon, the smell of baked squash and turkey crept in from the kitchen. Mrs. Retner insisted I stay. I didn't resist. We sat at the table together, a small trio sharing food and laughter. She carved the turkey with slow, practiced hands, recounting how her late husband used to overdo the gravy every single year. I listened, grateful for the warmth. After dessert, she pressed a tin of cookies into my hands. "In case the night feels cold," she said, her eyes soft. "And because I know they don't see you." "But I do." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to cry, but I didn't. I just nodded and thanked her, then slipped out into the fading daylight. Driving home, I passed my parents' house, lights glowing in every window. Shadows danced behind the curtains. Laughter floated faintly into the street. Somewhere in there, Daniel was toasting his fiancée, and they were probably taking selfies around a giant cake. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. My apartment was quiet when I walked in. The tin of cookies sat on my kitchen counter like a silent companion. I sat by the window legs curled beneath me and watched the evening settle. The snow had stopped falling. There was no turkey smell, no party chatter, but there was peace, a kind I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't born into wealth or prestige. I wasn't the golden child with accolades and shiny achievements, but I had spent my adult life helping shape the first steps and first words of dozens of children. I had helped new mothers navigate postpartum panic. I had taught toddlers with speech delays how to form full sentences through rhythm and song. I wasn't a babysitter. I was a builder of small worlds, an architect of early understanding. And yet to them, I was just the girl who changed diapers. I thought back to my childhood, how I used to wait by the door for my dad to come home and tell me about the city plans he worked on. I remember drawing little versions of our house and labeling each room. My mom would say, "You always want to organize the whole world." I guess I still did, just in a different way. I spent years crafting routines for toddlers, creating stability for working parents, offering presents where others only gave performance. I remembered nights I stayed late when a child's parent was stuck at the hospital. I remembered carrying a sleeping 5-year-old to bed after he had a night terror. I remembered all the little thank you notes in crayon taped to my door by tiny hands. None of it made headlines. None of it bought me prestige. But it was real. It mattered. And yet my family couldn't see past the job title. They saw nanny and decided I didn't fit. They didn't see the program I had built, the one I'd been testing with 3 families for the last 8 months, tracking developmental milestones and early literacy progress. They didn't see the spreadsheets on my laptop, the outlines of a curriculum designed to be scalable for low-income families. They didn't know I'd saved over $900,000 in investments and grants preparing to turn my project into something that could help communities nationwide. Because I never told them, not out of shame, but because I knew exactly what would happen once the numbers came out. They'd finally call me impressive, but it wouldn't be because they valued what I did. It would be because the world did, and I didn't need their praise. I needed their respect. Or maybe more honestly, I needed the freedom to stop chasing it. That night, I lit a candle and wrote down one sentence in my journal. "Let them think you are small. You are not here to be seen. You are here to build." It's strange how families can forget your beginnings even when they were there for all of them. Mine had seen me line up dolls as students when I was 6. They had watched me make flashcards for imaginary spelling bees, had heard me recite the alphabet song backwards just for fun. My father used to joke that I was born with a lesson plan in hand. But somehow, that memory faded for them. Maybe it got lost the day I said no to law school. Maybe it disappeared the day I enrolled in a community college for early childhood education instead of following the Ivy League dream they clung to so tightly for Daniel. I remember the day I told my mother. She pressed her lips together and said, "Well, at least it's still working with children. You've always been maternal." I had nodded, but inside I was sinking. I wanted her to say she was proud, that shaping young minds was just as noble as arguing in courtrooms. But she never said that. Instead, I learned to find pride elsewhere. I started with small nannying jobs during school. Quiet homes, messy toys, spilled applesauce. Over time, I grew into a professional. I studied child psychology. I certified in CPR developmental therapies, early language instruction. I worked in private homes for families who later referred me to others, until eventually I was one of the most sought-after private nannies in the city. I didn't post online. I didn't flaunt the travel or the generous pay or the elaborate birthday parties I helped organize. I did my job and I did it well. And quietly while others slept, I built something of my own. My real passion had always been the early years, the fragile foundation when a child's brain was still molding itself to the world. I had seen too many parents overwhelmed and under-resourced. I began to sketch a program, a structured guide for at-home early development with sensory-based activities, language cues, nutritional guidance, and behavioral tools. It was meant for everyone, but especially for those who couldn't afford nannies like me. I called it Sprout Steps. At first, it was just a Google Doc shared with 3 families, but I tracked their feedback, their progress. One child with a mild developmental delay began using full sentences 2 months after starting the program. Another, previously deemed nonverbal at age 3, began initiating communication. I applied for a small educational innovation grant and received $20,000. I used every cent on research and refinement. I hired a speech therapist part-time to help me revise the modules. I spent weekends in libraries and clinics gathering insight, adjusting tone-building frameworks. At 29, I created a pilot group of 10 families. At 31, I incorporated it as a nonprofit and began applying for larger grants. In the background, I managed my income meticulously. I had no car loan, no luxury expenses. I lived simply investing every extra dollar into my vision and my retirement portfolio. By the time I turned 32, I had saved over $950,000 across various accounts, a mixture of low-risk investments, compound interest growth, and grants I hadn't touched. And yet none of this made its way into family conversations, because every time I tried to share even a glimpse, it was dismissed. When I told my father about my nonprofit status, he asked if that meant I was still freelancing. When I showed my mother the website I built for Sprout Steps, she said, "That's nice, but when are you going to get a real job with benefits?" And so I stopped sharing. I stopped offering updates. I stopped hoping they would see me. Instead, I poured myself into my work. I took a contract consulting for a public school district looking to revamp their pre-K curriculum. I coached new nannies on structured play theory. I partnered with a local pediatric clinic to distribute printed versions of my program for free. I wasn't just watching children. I was shaping futures, quietly, completely. And all the while, I remained to them simply a caregiver, the woman who read stories and changed diapers. And maybe that was their loss, but it was also my liberation. Because if they couldn't see the architecture of what I was building, maybe they didn't deserve to walk through its doors. One night, a few weeks before Daniel's engagement, I stayed late at the community center where I had started holding free parent workshops. A young mother named Brianna came up to me, tears in her eyes. She held up a drawing her son had made of her labeled, "My Best Teacher." He hadn't spoken full sentences before Sprout Steps. Now he read 3-letter words. She hugged me and said, "You changed his life." No one in my family had ever said that to me. Not once. I drove home that night with her words ringing louder than any applause I had ever hoped to hear from my parents. My work wasn't glamorous. It wasn't framed or posted or toasted, but it was real. It mattered. And even if the world never knew I did. It was 5 days after Thanksgiving when everything shifted. I had just wrapped up a Saturday morning workshop at the public library, a session for new parents on building language skills through play. I was packing up my materials when I noticed a string of missed calls from a number I didn't recognize and one from Daniel. I ignored them at first, assuming it was just a logistical mix-up, or maybe a belated apology I wasn't ready to receive. But then, just as I stepped into my car, a message lit up my phone. It was from Natalie. She had never texted me before. The message was short. "Watch this." Attached was a video clip. I hesitated but pressed play. The video showed a lavishly decorated ballroom, soft golden lighting, and the hum of champagne chatter. At the front of the room stood a man in his 50s, trim suit, salt and pepper hair. I recognized him immediately. Jonathan Greer, CEO of Kinspire Tech, one of the most influential education technology firms in the country. He was a keynote speaker at the engagement party. I hadn't known that. He was holding a microphone, pausing as the crowd quieted. Before I begin, he said I'd like to thank someone very special. I understand she was supposed to be here tonight. I watched the video in disbelief. A few years ago, my daughter struggled with early language delays. We tried everything. Specialists, therapists. Nothing worked until we were handed a packet from a program called Sprout Steps. I later learned it was developed by a private nanny named Elena Kingsley. The room buzzed with whispers. Her method changed my daughter's life. And mine. I'm proud to say Kinspire Tech is in early talks to collaborate with Sprout Steps to expand access to early learning nationwide. Elena, if you're out there, thank you. The video ended. My hands trembled. My name had been spoken in that room. My work finally acknowledged, only I hadn't been there to hear it. Because I wasn't invited. Because I wasn't good enough. Because I was a nanny. I sat frozen in my car for what felt like hours. Eventually, I drove home, parked, and climbed the stairs to my apartment. I walked past the unopened engagement gift still under the bed. The next afternoon, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Daniel standing there with our parents behind him. My mother held a tin of muffins. My father looked stiff and uncomfortable. Daniel offered a sheepish smile. "Can we talk?" he asked. I didn't invite them in. I stepped outside and leaned against the railing. "Elena," my mother began, voice overly sweet. "We just wanted to check on you." "Check on me," I repeated, folding my arms. "After deciding I shouldn't be seen at your celebration." My father shifted his weight. Daniel stepped in quickly. "Look, I didn't know what Natalie's parents were planning. I didn't know about Greer until that night." I narrowed my eyes. "But you agreed with Mom and Dad that I didn't belong there, didn't you?" He looked down. "It was complicated." "No," I replied. "It was simple." "You were embarrassed." Silence stretched between us. My mother finally spoke. Jonathan's speech caught everyone off guard. "We had no idea you were working with families like his." I stared at her, heart thudding. And if he hadn't said anything, I asked. If he had never mentioned Sprout Steps, if no one important had praised me in front of you, would you be here right now? She didn't answer. Neither did Dad. "So, why are you here?" I asked. Daniel cleared his throat. "Greer asked if you'd be open to a partnership. Kinspire Tech wants to integrate Sprout Steps into their platform. Natalie said it could be a huge opportunity. He wants to meet with you next week." There it was, the real reason, the shift. Not guilt, not love, business. My chest tightened. "You came to apologize," I said slowly, "but you brought a pitch." "It's not like that," Mom insisted. "We're proud of you." "Truly." I shook my head. "You're proud of what the world finally told you was worth something. You weren't proud of the years I spent changing lives in silence. You didn't see value until someone else did." My voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. "If Jonathan Greer never spoke my name, you'd still be embarrassed of me." "That's not true," Daniel protested. "Then prove it," I said. "Tell me this isn't about the deal. Tell me you would have come anyway." He faltered. My father tried to step in. "Look, this is a big moment. Maybe we didn't handle things right, but I cut him off. This isn't about handling. This is about respect, or the lack of it." I turned and opened my front door. I'm not interested in being brought back into the fold because I became useful. I'm not for sale. And neither is my work. My mother reached for my hand. "Sweetheart, can't we start over?" I looked at her hand. I remembered all the years I offered mine, only to be left waiting. "If you want to rebuild something real with me," I said, "it doesn't start with a business deal. It starts with seeing me as enough, even when I'm invisible." And then, quietly, I closed the door. 2 days after that confrontation on my porch, just when I thought the silence would stretch on again, they returned. No warning. No text. just the crunch of snow under tires and the dull knock of my father's knuckles against the front door. I had been in the middle of reviewing curriculum feedback from one of the Sprout Steps pilot families. I wiped my hands on my jeans and opened the door slowly. There stood my mother in her red wool coat, the same one she always wore to church. Her eyes looked tired or maybe just unsure. My father stood beside her, hands in his pockets, rocking slightly on his heels as if waiting to be dismissed before he even began. "Hi, sweetheart," my mom said softly. "Can we come in?" I hesitated, then stepped aside. Not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I was ready to close this chapter properly. We sat in the living room. Nothing had changed since their last visit. Same couch, same crooked lamp. The gift I had bought for Daniel and Natalie still sat on the corner table untouched, wrapped in gold foil with a bow that had started to curl at the edges. My mother noticed it but said nothing. She folded her hands in her lap and began, "We want to start over. We made a mistake, Elena. A big one." I nodded slowly. "Yes, you did." My father cleared his throat. "We were wrong to exclude you. We didn't mean to hurt you." I looked him dead in the eye. "You didn't mean to." He blinked. "You told me I wouldn't fit in. You decided my life was too small for your party. You said nothing when I was erased from the guest list of my own brother's future." They were quiet. I let the silence expand heavy and awkward. "You didn't mean to," I repeated. "No, you just didn't think I'd push back." My mother opened her mouth to object, but closed it again. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "I want to be clear," I said, voice steady. "I'm not here to argue. I'm not here to convince you of my worth. I'm not here to be pulled back into a family that only acknowledges me when there's something to gain." "We're not here for money," my mother said quickly. "I swear. We just want to understand." I tilted my head. "Then, why now?" My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Why only after you found out what I've built?" I continued. "Why after the CEO praised me in a room full of people? Why after my work became useful to your pride?" They didn't answer. They couldn't. I exhaled and stood up. I walked to the bookshelf, pulled out one of the first printed versions of Sprout Steps, and held it in my hands. I ran my fingers over the cover. Then I turned back to them. "I'm not ashamed of my work," I said. Never was. The only thing I regret is letting your silence shrink me for so long. I thought if I tried hard enough, succeeded quietly enough, gave lovingly enough, that one day you'd see me. Not for what I do, but for who I am. My mother's eyes glistened. "We were trying to protect Daniel's moment. We didn't mean to erase yours." "But you did," I replied, voice calm. "And I've spent years forgiving and waiting to be enough. This is where that ends." My father swallowed hard. "So what happens now?" I walked slowly to the front door and opened it. The winter air poured in. "What happens now," I said, "is that you decide whether you can love me for who I am, not who you wish I had been. But you do it from the other side of this door." My mother stood but didn't move. Her lips trembled like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. I didn't fill the silence for her. For once, I let it speak. After a long moment, they stepped outside. I closed the door behind them, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with clarity. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't replay their words or wonder if I was too harsh. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and the tin of muffins they had left behind. I didn't touch them. I stared at them like an artifact, a symbol of too late gestures and misplaced guilt. I realized something profound then. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad either. I was simply done. Done hoping. Done pleading. Done making room in my heart for people who only showed up when I was marketable. And that felt like freedom. Almost a year passed since I closed that door. In that time, I heard very little from my family. A birthday card arrived in April signed Mom and Dad with no message inside. There was a short text at Christmas from Daniel saying he hoped I was well. I replied, "You too." That was it. No drama, no collapse, just distance. And strangely, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt grounded because without the noise of their expectations, I began to hear my own voice more clearly. I threw myself fully into Sprout Steps. I finalized partnerships with 2 community clinics, expanding access to 20 more families. I began hosting weekly open sessions at a local center, inviting parents from all walks of life. The room would fill with laughter, finger paint, and stories of real joy and exhaustion. Word began to spread, not because I chased attention, but because the work mattered. Then, something unexpected happened. People started seeking me out, not reporters or funders or family with regrets, but real people. Women from my old community college days reached out through email or LinkedIn. One wrote, "You're the reason I didn't quit the program. I remember your talk about kids with challenges, and now I run my own home daycare." Another messaged, "How did you build your portfolio? I want to learn to invest the way you did." I started saying yes. I gave talks not to impress, but to equip. I showed young women how to open a Roth IRA on a nanny salary. I created a free ebook on early financial literacy for childcare workers. I led workshops on how to transition from caregiving to curriculum development. Not for fame, not for applause, but because I wanted them to know you can build something powerful without permission. You can create legacy in quiet ways. One afternoon, after a session at the community garage where I volunteered on weekends, I returned to my car and found a small, folded note tucked under the wiper. No name, just a few lines handwritten. "Thank you for showing me that worth isn't something you earn with degrees or titles. It's something you carry when no one's looking. You made me feel seen." I sat in the driver's seat holding that note and felt something unlock in my chest. Not pride, not vindication, just peace. True, rooted peace. Later that evening, I stood in the backyard of the small home I had bought years earlier, the one my parents had never visited. I looked out over the modest garden I had cultivated with my own 2 hands. The apple trees I planted were beginning to bud, their branches reaching upward in soft defiance of winter's retreat. I always wanted a yard like this. Nothing grand, nothing for show. Just mine. A place where things could grow in honesty. That evening, my best friend Jillian pulled up in her old Jeep, 2 coffees in hand and a pink box of donuts balanced on her arm. She was my partner in Sprout Steps now, co-director confidant, and my loudest champion. "You working again?" she teased as she walked up. I wiped sawdust off my sleeves. "Always." We sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, sipping slowly, wrapped in quiet. "You ever think about going back?" she asked softly. I didn't have to ask what she meant. "No," I said after a moment. "Not unless they can see me without the $1 million first." She nodded. "They probably won't." "I know." I looked at her, this person who never once made me feel small, who had seen me in overalls and thought, "That's strength," not, "That's failure." You know what I said watching the wind move through the apple blossoms. I finally feel like I'm not trying to fix the wrong engine anymore. Jillian laughed, tossing a donut hole my way. That's the most mechanic way I've ever heard someone say, "I found peace." But she wasn't wrong. I wasn't fixing them anymore. I wasn't waiting to be invited back to a table I was never meant to sit at. I was building my own table plank by plank, chair by chair, for people who brought truth, not pretense. Spring came gently that year, and with it, a sense of renewal I hadn't expected. Sprout Steps gained national attention when a journalist from an education blog reached out for an interview. She had heard about our impact in low-income communities and wanted to spotlight the program. I agreed on one condition: that the focus remain on the families, not on me. The article went viral anyway. My inbox flooded with messages from parents, teachers, childcare workers. Some wrote from tiny towns I had never heard of, saying I didn't think someone like me could ever build something like this. And every time I read one of those notes, I smiled. Not because they admired me, but because they had begun to admire themselves. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to speak at a conference for early education leaders in New York. I almost declined. Public speaking had never been my goal, but Jillian urged me to go. Not for them, she said, for the girls in the back rows who need to know they belong. So I went. I stood on that stage in a simple navy dress, no flashy branding, no dramatic reveal. Just me and a microphone and a room full of educators. I spoke about the power of invisible labor of teaching children to feel safe, curious, loved. I told them that legacy isn't built in applause, but in repetition, in every bedtime story read, every tear wiped, every first word celebrated. When I finished, the room was silent for a breath, and then a wave of applause rose soft and sincere. It didn't fill a void in me. It simply echoed what I already knew. That night, back in my hotel room, I stood by the window overlooking the city lights. I whispered something I had never dared to say aloud. I am not a loser. I never was. I thought back to that phone call with my mother the moment she told me I wouldn't fit in. I thought of how many times I had swallowed my voice to protect their comfort, and I realized I didn't need them to acknowledge me anymore, because I had already done what they never could. I had built something meaningful without erasing who I was. The next morning, I checked my phone, a message from Daniel. Just read the article. It was beautiful. I'm sorry for everything. I replied, thank you, no more, no less. No, forgiveness didn't mean reopening the door. It meant no longer standing behind it. I stepped out onto the balcony and let the wind lift my hair. Somewhere below, a city hummed with stories like mine. Quiet builders, invisible founders, women with hands full of finger paint and spreadsheets. I wasn't alone. I never had been. I just hadn't realized yet that being unseen didn't mean being unworthy. That day, I began writing the next chapter of the Sprout Steps Handbook. The title of the new module was simple: You Belong.